Now, one way of viewing the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah is that the written text is like a zipped or compressed file. Our written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is like a compressed or zipped file containing the general contents of God's revelation. But it's very clear that when you read the written text of the Torah, that it needs to be unzipped. There is an entire mountain that exists beneath the tip of the iceberg that is the written Torah. In other words, the written Torah is one side of the proverbial coin. When you hold that coin, it testifies itself to the fact there's another side. And that other side to the written Torah is the oral Torah. Let's just look at a few examples, and I could share with you thousands. Number 1, the Torah we have, the written Torah, is clearly a legal code. It contains hundreds of commandments, things that we're obligated to do, things that we're prohibited from doing, and there are many times penalties for violating the laws of the Torah. That's clear. Important question. At what age does a person become responsible and culpable for violating the laws of the Torah? Can a 6-year-old child be punished for violating the Sabbath? Can a 10-year-old child be punished for eating a cheeseburger? What age does a person become responsible for observing the Torah? Torah doesn't say. It's not written anywhere in the Torah. Well, how do we know? This was explained to us in the oral part of the Torah. In the book of Numbers, chapter 29, verse 1, we're told in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. It shall be a day of sounding or blowing for you. That's all the Torah says about our Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. All we're told, on the 7th month, the first day, it's a holy day, you have to have no laborious work done, and it's a day of blowing or sounding. Doesn't even tell you what this holiday is celebrating. What is it for? What's it about? What does it mean to blow something? What are we blowing or sounding? It doesn't say. None of the details are provided in the Torah. It sort of is a pregnant passage which screams out, more information is needed. That information is provided in our oral Torah, which explains that what you're going to blow is a horn, a ram's horn. And we're told exactly what to blow. You don't blow the Star-Spangled Banner or O Canada. There are certain notes that you're supposed to blow. And all of those instructions are explicated in the oral Torah. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 27, the next holiday, we're told on the 10th day of the 7th month, 10 days later, shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you, and you shall afflict yourselves. Now, what does that mean, to afflict yourself? How does a person afflict themselves? Some people might afflict themselves by not having coffee in the morning. Or maybe they afflict themselves by not having sugar to put in their coffee. Or maybe they would afflict themselves by listening to classical music. Some people find that irritating. Maybe some people would find it irritating to sit with a life insurance salesman for 2 hours. But what does it mean to afflict yourselves? The Torah doesn't describe what is to be done. The written text just says it's a day where you have to afflict yourselves. And yet the oral Torah explains exactly what that means. We fast, we don't eat, we don't drink, etc. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 39 to 43 describes the festival of tabernacles, Sukkot. In verse 40, we're told, take a pre-Eitz Hadar. It's not clear how to translate that. Is pre-Eitz Hadar a beautiful fruit of a tree or the fruit of a beautiful tree? And at the end of the day, what is it referring to when it says take the pre-Eitz Hadar? Apple, pear, kiwi, what are we supposed to take? It's not in the Torah. And then we're told to take that with branches of date palms, willows, and myrtle leaves. But take it and do what? The Torah just says take them. What do you do with them? For what purpose? None of that is explained about this incredibly important holiday. And then in verse 42, We're told you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. Well, how do you construct a booth exactly? Are there rules? And then if it says to dwell in the booth for 7 days, can you leave for a few minutes? Can you go for a walk? Can you go to work? Or it seems to say you have to dwell in the booth for 7 days. So what are the laws of this holiday? We're not told in the written text. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8, this is the passage of Shema Yisrael. It says, you shall bind them as a sign upon your arm, and they will be as totafot between your eyes. Bind what as a sign on your arm? What exactly does that mean? And what in the world are totafot? If you read the text of the Bible, these are unexplainable. It doesn't mean anything. And yet the oral Torah explains these are our phylacteries, and we're taught exactly how to make them. They're made out of leather, they have to be square, there are certain parchment scrolls inside. Again, all of the details are missing from the written text. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21. It basically says you don't need to come to the holy temple in order to be able to eat meat. You can actually, we're told, eat meat wherever you would like. The only thing is you have to slaughter the animal as I have commanded you, God says. The text of the Bible, the Torah, written Torah says, you have to slaughter the animal as I have commanded you. And yet you could look through the entire Bible from top to bottom, you won't find any instructions on how to slaughter an animal. So what does it mean when it says, slaughter the animal as I have commanded you? Where are those instructions? Where are they found? They're found in the oral Torah. The Torah prohibits doing any melacha on the Sabbath. There are about 12 times the Torah prohibits doing melacha on the Sabbath. For example, in Exodus chapter 31, verse 15, and we're told that if you do melacha on the Sabbath, it's a capital crime, a capital offense. The problem is, what does this mean, don't do melacha? It doesn't mean work. The word for work in the Bible in Hebrew would be avodah. The Torah doesn't say don't do avodah. And even if it did, by the way, what would that mean? Even if the Bible said don't do avodah, what does work mean? Does it mean don't go to work? Does it mean don't do something which is strenuous? Does it mean don't do something which physicists would define as work? Where in physics, if you move a object over force moved over a distance is work. So picking up this Talmud and moving it across the room would be work in terms of physics. What does it mean don't do any work? Even that's not clear. But at least the word is understood. We know we have a handle on the word work. But the word melacha has no other places in the Bible that it's used. So what does the Torah mean when it says you cannot do melacha on the Sabbath? What is included in that prohibition? And that we have to be so careful because if we do melacha, there can be a death penalty, theoretically. It's not explained in the written text, but it is found very clearly explicated in the oral Torah. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21, Lo sevashel gedi bechalev imo or bechalav imo. If you open up a Torah scroll, you'll see there are no punctuation marks, there are no dots, there are no vowel markings. So the word chet lamed bet can be read as chalav, milk, or chalev, fat. So are we told not to boil a kid in its mother's milk or in its mother's fat? So the actual reading of the Torah itself we wouldn't know without an oral explanation. Exodus chapter 25 verse 9 and Numbers chapter 8 verse 4 tell us that Moses was shown a diagram, was given a vision of what the tabernacle was to look like. When God gave the instructions to how to build a tabernacle in the desert, the Torah tells us that it was done by Moses according to the vision that was shown him by God. It's very difficult just to write a few paragraphs like the Torah has and think that you can actually put together a mishkan, a tabernacle. It's not so simple. So in order to communicate it to Moses clearly, God actually showed him a vision. I don't know of any Bible that contains pictures or diagrams. So clearly there is information that was given to Moses that was not written in the Bible itself. And these are just a few examples. On one level, The oral Torah gives all of the details that are not contained in the brief general descriptions found in the written Torah. One of the simplest ways, it's not really the most accurate way, but one of the simplest ways of understanding the oral Torah is that it's the details about all of the commandments that are found in the written text that are not fleshed out in the text itself. Now, the word Torah means instruction or teaching. The written Torah, if you pick up 5 books of Moses, the written Torah is like a table of contents of Jewish living. That's what the written Torah is. It's like a table of contents. But the full exposition only appears through the oral Torah. However, on another level, the written Torah and the oral Torah work hand in glove together. And what they do together is to provide a stereoscopic richness that you would not get if you only had one of them. Let me give you an example. If you pick up the written text of the Torah, it says in 3 different places, in discussing the laws of causing bodily injury to someone, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. That's what the Torah says very clearly, 3 different places. If you cause bodily harm to someone, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. Now, why is it that for the entire period of Jewish history, since we became a people and left Egypt, why is it that no Jewish court ever handed out, never imposed that kind of punishment? Why is it? The Torah says it very clearly, and yet no Jewish court ever chopped off someone's hand or ripped out someone's eye. And the reason is because the oral Torah that we have explained that this was not the actual penalty that was to be imposed. The oral Torah taught that if you chop off someone's hand, you must monetarily compensate them for 5 things. Number 1, the medical treatments they're going to have to pay for, that's going to be on your tab. Number 2, their lost wages. If they're injured and they can't work for 6 months, you have to pay them for their back wages. Number 3, the court will assess the value of the limb that you injured. Don't ask me how that's done, but they might say that an eye is worth $200,000, a hand $100,000. Whatever their assessment is, you have to pay them for the value of the limb that you hurt. Number 4, you have to pay them for the pain that you caused them in the injury. And also the court will assess how much the pain is worth. And number 5, you have to pay for the embarrassment they feel as a result of the injury. That's the actual practice in Judaism.